I never thought learning how to drive would end up changing my life. At first, it was just supposed to be a favor. My best friend had no interest in teaching me. My parents worked crazy hours. Driving schools around town were booked for months. Then one Saturday morning, my best friend casually looked over at his dad and said, "Hey, Dad, why don't you just teach Mike? You're always complaining nobody knows how to drive properly anymore." I laughed. His dad didn't. Instead, John looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug and asked, "You serious about getting your license?" I nodded. "Then we'll start tomorrow." That one sentence ended up changing everything. At the time, I was 19. I had finished my first year of college, was back home for the summer, and felt like everyone else was moving forward except me. My friends had cars, jobs, internships. I still rode buses everywhere and borrowed rides whenever I needed them. Getting my license felt like finally becoming an adult. John was 46. He worked as a project manager for a construction company, the kind of guy who seemed capable of fixing anything with a toolbox and enough patience. He wasn't loud or intimidating. Actually, he was the opposite. Calm, measured, the kind of person who never raised his voice because he never had to. I'd known him since I was 12. He'd driven us to baseball practice, grilled burgers during summer weekends, and once spent an entire afternoon helping me repair my bike after I'd crashed into a mailbox. He'd always treated me like another son. Nothing more. At least that's what I believed. The next morning, I showed up at their house just before 9. My best friend was still asleep. John was already outside washing his dark blue SUV. "Morning, Mike. Morning. You eat breakfast?" "Yeah." He nodded approvingly. "Good. Empty stomachs make nervous drivers worse." I laughed. I didn't know that was a thing. It's not. I just made it up. That caught me off guard. I'd always thought of him as serious, but he smirked just enough to let me know he enjoyed catching people by surprise. "Grab a towel," he said. "Help me finish this and then we'll head to the empty parking lot." For 20 minutes we worked side by side without much conversation. It wasn't awkward. Actually, it felt surprisingly comfortable. John never forced small talk. If neither of us had anything to say, we simply kept working. Eventually he tossed the towel into a bucket. "Ready as I'll ever be." He handed me the keys. "No." I blinked. "What?" "You're driving there." "What?" "The neighborhood's quiet. Best way to learn is by doing." "I've literally never driven before." "I know. I could hit something." "Then don't." He said it so matter-of-factly that I actually laughed. "You really trust me with your car?" "I trust myself to stop you before you destroy it." That somehow made me feel better. We climbed inside. The leather seats smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. John adjusted the mirrors while I stared at the steering wheel like it belonged on a spaceship. "Relax. I'm trying." "No, you're panicking. I can do both." That earned another small smile. He spent the next 10 minutes explaining everything patiently. Mirrors, pedals, signals, seat position. He never rushed. Whenever I apologized for asking another question, he'd simply say, "Questions are cheaper than accidents." By the time we reached the empty shopping center parking lot, my hands weren't shaking quite as much. "Okay," he said. "Start the engine." The SUV hummed to life. "Now ease off the brake." I did. Too quickly. The SUV lurched forward. I nearly screamed. John reached over and steadied the wheel without grabbing it from me. "Easy. Sorry. No apologies. I almost killed us. You almost startled us. There wasn't much difference." "There is." His voice stayed calm. Always calm. Somehow that made me calmer too. For the next hour I practiced stopping, turning, parking, and driving slow circles around empty rows of parking spaces. Every mistake felt enormous. John treated every mistake like it was expected. "Again. I messed that up. I know. So do it again." No frustration. No disappointment. Just another lap. By noon, I could actually park between two lines without climbing the curb. "See?" he said. "I told you. I honestly thought I'd be terrible." "You were." I stared at him. He grinned. "But you're getting better." I rolled my eyes. "Thanks. That's the compliment." As we headed back toward his house, I realized something. I hadn't been nervous for almost half an hour. We parked in the driveway. My best friend was finally awake, sitting on the porch scrolling through his phone. Well, John answered before I could. He only tried to kill us twice. What? I'm kidding, John said. He did fine. My best friend looked genuinely surprised. Seriously? I shrugged, trying not to smile too much. I guess. John tossed me the keys again. Same time Tuesday. Already? You wanted your license. I do. Then practice. There wasn't really room to argue. As I walked home that afternoon, I caught myself looking back toward their house. John was putting the hose away. He glanced up. For just a second, our eyes met across the street. He lifted a hand in a simple wave. I waved back. At the time, it felt like nothing. Just another ordinary summer afternoon. I had no idea those driving lessons were about to become the part of every week I looked forward to most. The next few weeks settled into a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I'd walk over to John's house after work, and we'd spend 2 hours driving around town. At first, we stuck to empty parking lots, then quiet neighborhoods, eventually 2-lane roads. Every lesson ended with John giving me one thing I'd done well and one thing to improve. He never overloaded me, never criticized me just to criticize. Good lane control today, he'd say. Then, but you're still braking too late. Simple, clear, manageable. It made me want to improve. By the 4th lesson, I wasn't terrified anymore. I was actually starting to enjoy driving. Left at the next light, John said. I flicked on the turn signal. Nice. What? You remembered without me telling you. I smiled. I guess I'm learning. You are. It was funny how much those 2 words meant coming from him. John wasn't the type to hand out compliments just to make people feel good. If he said you were improving, you believed him. One evening, rain started halfway through our lesson. Big summer drops splattered across the windshield. I instinctively tightened my grip on the wheel. You okay? John asked. I hate driving in rain. You've never driven in rain. I hate the idea of driving in rain. He chuckled. Fair enough. The wipers swept steadily across the windshield while he calmly explained how to increase following distance and brake earlier. His voice never changed. Whether the roads were empty or busy, he sounded exactly the same. Calm, confident. I realized that was becoming my favorite thing about him. When I got nervous, he didn't. About an hour later, we stopped at a small diner outside town. My treat, John said. You don't have to. I know. Inside, the waitress greeted him by name. The usual? You know it. She smiled at me. And for your son? John answered before I could. Not my son. The waitress looked embarrassed. Oh, I'm sorry. John simply smiled. No harm done. I expected the moment to feel awkward. Instead, neither of us mentioned it again. Still, for some reason, I kept thinking about it. While we waited for our food, we actually talked. Not about driving, about life. So, John asked, what are you studying again? Graphic design. You still enjoy it? I do. But, I laughed. How'd you know there was a but? You hesitated. I stared at him. You notice everything, don't you? Comes with age. I sighed. I just don't know if I'm good enough. He leaned back in the booth. You know what confidence is? What? Evidence. I frowned. People think confidence comes first. It doesn't. It comes after you've proven something to yourself enough times. I thought about that while stirring my soda. I never looked at it that way. Most people don't. He took a bite of his sandwich before adding, You're too hard on yourself. Those words stayed with me long after dinner. As the weeks passed, our conversations became easier. Sometimes we'd spend 10 minutes talking before we even started the engine. Other times we'd drive for miles in comfortable silence. It never felt forced. One Thursday, my best friend climbed into the back seat before we left. I want to see how bad Mike is. John looked at me. You okay with that? I shrugged. Sure. 5 minutes later, Dude, my friend shouted. That stop was awful. It wasn't awful, John replied. It was rough. There's a difference. I thought we were gonna die. John looked in the mirror. You say that every time someone else drives. I do not. You absolutely do. I couldn't stop laughing. Neither could John. By the end of the lesson, all three of us were joking around. It reminded me why I loved spending time with their family. They had a way of making everything feel easy. A few days later, my best friend left for a weekend baseball tournament. John's wife had gone to visit her sister for several days. That left just John at home. When Tuesday rolled around, I almost texted to ask if we were still meeting. Before I could, my phone buzzed. John, lessons still on. 6 o'clock? Me works for me. When I arrived, his SUV wasn't in the driveway. Instead, his older pickup truck sat there. He walked out carrying 2 bottles of water. We're taking the truck today. I've never driven a truck. That's why we're taking it. I laughed. You're relentless. I prefer thorough. The truck felt completely different. Higher off the ground. Longer. Harder to judge. I stalled twice trying to park it between 2 lines. John didn't react. Again. I knew you were going to say that. I know. I hate that you're always right. No, you don't. I smiled despite myself. No, I don't. On the drive back, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light spilled across the road ahead of us. Traffic was light. Windows down. Warm air drifting through the cab. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then John asked quietly, "Can I tell you something?" "Sure. I've enjoyed these lessons." I glanced at him briefly before looking back at the road. "Really? You ask good questions." "I ask too many questions." "No. You want to understand before you act. That's a good quality." Hearing that from him felt strangely personal. More personal than any driving advice he'd given me. "I've enjoyed them too," I admitted. "I'm glad." He looked out the passenger window for a moment. "I wasn't sure if you'd stick with it. I almost quit after the first lesson." "I know. You knew. You looked ready to throw the keys at me." I laughed. "I probably was. I'm glad you didn't." His words lingered in the quiet truck cab. So did the silence that followed. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt different. Like somewhere along the way, these lessons had quietly become about more than learning to drive. I just hadn't figured out what that more was yet. By the middle of July, driving wasn't the hard part anymore. Parallel parking still gave me nightmares, but I could handle traffic, merge onto the highway without panicking, and even navigate downtown without gripping the steering wheel like my life depended on it. John noticed before I did. "You've stopped looking at me every 5 seconds." "What?" "The first few lessons, every time you made a decision, you'd glance over to see if I approved." "I did. You don't anymore." I thought about it. He was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd started trusting myself. "I guess that's a good sign." "It is." He smiled. "It means you're becoming your own driver." A few days later, my best friend called me. "I can't make it Friday." "Why?" "My girlfriend's family invited us to the lake." "Have fun. You should still go over." "For driving?" "Yeah. Dad already planned another lesson." I laughed. "He plans these things like they're business meetings." "That's because he's a dad." Friday evening was unusually warm. John was waiting outside when I arrived, tossing a small cooler into the back of the SUV. "Road trip?" "Sort of." "Where are we going?" "You'll see." That answer somehow didn't surprise me anymore. We drove almost 40 minutes out of town. The roads became narrower. The traffic disappeared. Eventually, we reached a quiet stretch of rolling countryside where farms sat behind long wooden fences. "This is where I learned," John said. "You grew up around here?" He nodded. "My parents still own some land about 10 minutes away. It's beautiful." "It is." The roads were perfect for practicing. Gentle curves. Very little traffic. No pressure. As I settled into the drive, John leaned his elbow against the window. So, you've seemed distracted lately." I kept my eyes on the road. "Have I?" "A little." I hesitated. "It doesn't have anything to do with driving." I figured. He didn't push. He simply waited. "I've been thinking about whether I should move after college. Big city. Maybe. Part of me wants to. And the other part? I don't know." I shrugged. This place is home. John nodded slowly. Sometimes both choices are good. I wish one of them felt obviously right. He looked out across the fields. When I was your age, I thought every decision had one perfect answer. And I was wrong. That made me smile. What changed your mind? Life. We stopped beside a small overlook where you could see miles of farmland stretching toward the horizon. John climbed out first. Come on. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. We leaned against the fence overlooking the valley. I used to come here after high school, he said, when I needed to think. I can see why. Neither of us spoke for a while. There was something peaceful about standing there. No phones, no traffic, just wind moving through the fields. I appreciate you doing all this, I said finally. The lessons, the extra time. He looked at me. I know. I mean it. So do I. He folded his arms across the fence. You've become important to this family, Mike. You've always been there for us. The words caught me off guard. I've just been your son's friend. John shook his head. No, you've been more than that. You've shown up. You helped us move. You visited my wife after her surgery. You never needed to be asked. I looked down, suddenly embarrassed. I didn't think it was a big deal. It was. His voice stayed calm, but there was a sincerity behind it that made me look back up. People remember who shows up. For a second, neither of us looked away. Then a truck passed on the road behind us, breaking the moment. John cleared his throat. We should get back before it gets dark. Yeah. The drive home was quieter than usual. Not awkward, just thoughtful. I found myself replaying what he'd said. You've become important to this family. It was probably something any caring adult would say. So why did it keep echoing in my head? The next week, I finally scheduled my driving test. I texted John before I could lose my nerve. Me booked it. A minute later, my phone buzzed. John, good. Another message followed. John, you'll do fine. No long speech. No dramatic encouragement. Just quiet confidence. Oddly enough, it settled my nerves better than anything else could have. The night before the test, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, John stood there holding a small paper bag. I was in the neighborhood. You were. No. He smiled. I wasn't. I laughed. I figured. He handed me the bag. Inside was a travel mug with a local coffee shop logo on it. What's this? Tomorrow morning. I remembered you saying bad coffee ruins your mood. I stared at him. You remembered that? You've mentioned it more than once. I couldn't help smiling. You really do notice everything. Occupational hazard. We stood there on my porch for another minute. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to end the conversation. Finally, he nodded toward the street. Get some sleep. I'll try. You've earned this. As he walked back to his SUV, I found myself watching until his taillights disappeared around the corner. I didn't understand why that simple visit meant so much. Maybe because no one outside my own family had ever believed in me that quietly. No speeches, no pressure, just showing up. The next morning, as I drove toward the testing center with the coffee mug sitting in the cup holder beside me, I realized I wanted one thing almost as much as getting my license. I wanted to make John proud. That thought surprised me, and judging by how often it returned during the drive, it wasn't going away anytime soon. The morning of my driving test felt strangely quiet. I arrived 20 minutes early. The travel mug John had given me was still warm in my hand, even though I'd barely touched the coffee inside. My stomach was too full of nerves. I checked my phone. One new message. John, remember what we practiced. Don't rush. That was it. No good luck. No dramatic pep talk. Just the same calm advice he'd been giving me all summer. Oddly enough, it worked. The examiner was a woman in her 50s who barely smiled. Ready as I'll ever be. She marked something on her clipboard. We'll see. The next 25 minutes passed in a blur. Left turns, lane changes, parallel parking, a three-point turn. Every time I started to panic, I heard John's voice in my head. Don't rush. Look where you want the car to go. Questions are cheaper than accidents. By the time we pulled back into the parking lot, I honestly had no idea how I'd done. The examiner checked her paperwork. Then she looked at me. Congratulations. I blinked. You passed. For a second, I just stared at her. Really? She smiled for the first time. Really? The first person I called wasn't my parents. It wasn't even my best friend. It was John. He answered after 2 rings. Everything okay? I passed. There was a brief pause. Then I heard him laugh. Not a polite chuckle. A genuine laugh. I knew you would. I actually did it. I never doubted it. I leaned against the side of the building, grinning like an idiot. Thanks. You earned it, Mike. No. I mean, thank you. For all of it. His voice softened. You don't owe me anything. I know. But I'm still grateful. There was another comfortable silence. Then he cleared his throat. Dinner tonight? To celebrate? If you're free. I'll be there. That evening their backyard was full of familiar faces. My best friend was flipping burgers with exaggerated confidence while John's wife kept reminding him not to burn them. You know, she laughed. Your father actually knows how to use a grill. I've got this. No, you don't. Everyone laughed. It felt like every other summer cookout we'd ever had. Except somehow, didn't. Maybe because I kept catching myself looking toward John. Or maybe because every time our eyes met, he'd give me a small nod like we shared some private accomplishment. Not a secret, just something we'd worked for together. Later that evening, everyone drifted inside to watch a baseball game. I stayed on the deck, enjoying the cooler air. A minute later, the sliding door opened. John stepped outside carrying 2 bottles of sparkling water. He handed one to me. I figured you'd escaped. I needed 5 minutes. So did I. We leaned against the railing. The yard was quiet except for crickets beginning their nightly chorus. I've been thinking, John said. That's usually dangerous. He smiled. I suppose. You don't need driving lessons anymore. I guess not. I'll miss them. The words came out before I could think. I immediately wished I could take them back. John looked over at me. So will I. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The realization settled between us. Those twice-a-week lessons had become part of both our routines. Now they were over. Funny how something could become important without you realizing it until it ended. What now? I asked. John shrugged. You'll probably be too busy enjoying your freedom. I'll probably drive everywhere for no reason. You will. I did. I laughed. You? My first month with a license? He nodded. I once drove 40 minutes just because I wanted ice cream from a place I'd never been to. Worth it? No. The ice cream was terrible. We both laughed. As the laughter faded, John grew thoughtful. You know something? What? When you first sat behind the wheel. I honestly wasn't sure you'd enjoy driving. I wasn't either. But somewhere along the way, he searched for the words. You relaxed. So did our conversations. I nodded. I noticed that. It stopped feeling like lessons. It started feeling like... I paused. Hanging out. He smiled. Exactly. The sliding door opened again. There you guys are, my best friend called. Mom says dessert's ready. We're coming, John answered. As my friend disappeared back inside, John remained where he was for another moment. You heading back to school next month? Yeah. Looking forward to it? A little. And a little nervous? Mostly that. He nodded. That's normal. You'll do well. You always sound so sure. I'm old enough to recognize potential when I see it. I looked away, suddenly embarrassed. You make me sound better than I am. No. I think you still underestimate yourself. When I finally drove home that night, alone, for the very first time, I noticed something unexpected. I kept reaching toward the passenger seat. Not because anyone was there, because for weeks someone had been. Every turn, every stop sign, every decision, I'd gotten used to hearing John's calm voice beside me. Now the seat was empty. The silence felt different, not lonely, just unfamiliar. I realized I'd grown used to having him there. And if I was honest with myself, I was going to miss that more than the lessons themselves. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed. John, proud of you today. I read the message twice before replying. Me, Couldn't have done it without you. Three dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. A few seconds later, one final message arrived. John, I think you could have. I smiled at the screen. Maybe he was right. But deep down, I knew something else was true. Learning to drive had given me independence. It had also given me a friendship with John that had quietly become one of the most meaningful parts of my summer. And with college only a few weeks away, I couldn't shake the feeling that saying goodbye to that routine was going to be much harder than I'd expected. August arrived faster than I wanted. In just over 2 weeks, I'd be heading back to college. For most people my age, that would have been exciting. For me, it felt strangely bittersweet. Not because I didn't want to go back, because I knew one chapter of my summer was ending. Now that I had my license, I found excuses to drive almost every day. I'd volunteer to pick up groceries, offer rides to friends, take the long way home after work. Sometimes I'd catch myself using phrases John had repeated dozens of times. Leave yourself more space. Look farther ahead. Don't react, anticipate. One afternoon, I laughed out loud when I realized I was repeating them under my breath. He'd become the little voice in my head whenever I drove. A few days later, my best friend texted me. Need help moving some furniture tomorrow? Dad borrowed a trailer. I answered almost immediately. Sure. What time? Saturday morning was hot enough that everyone was sweating before we'd even started loading boxes. My best friend disappeared halfway through to help his girlfriend. That left John and me finishing the last few pieces ourselves. You always volunteer for the heavy lifting, John said as we carried an old bookshelf into the garage. I guess I like feeling useful. You don't have to earn your place around here, Mike. I looked at him. What do you mean? He set his end of the bookshelf down before answering. You've always acted like you need to repay kindness. I've noticed. I frowned. I do. You thank people 5 times for one favor. I laughed awkwardly. I never realized. I know. He smiled. But you don't have to. After we'd finished, we sat on the tailgate of the truck drinking cold lemonade. Neither of us seemed in any hurry to go inside. You excited for school? John asked. I think so. You don't sound convinced. I've been wondering what comes after college. Career. Maybe moving. Maybe staying. It feels like everyone expects me to have everything figured out. John chuckled quietly. I'm 46. I still don't have everything figured out. I looked over at him. Seriously. Absolutely. I've changed careers once. We've moved twice. There are still days I wonder if I'm making the right decisions. That surprised me. You always seem so certain. I've learned something. What? You don't need certainty. You need direction. I rolled those words around in my head. Direction, not certainty. It sounded simple, but somehow it explained exactly what I'd been struggling with. You always know what to say. No. He smiled. I've just had more years to make mistakes. That evening, after everyone else had gone inside, John asked, Feel like taking one last drive? I raised an eyebrow. I thought I graduated. You did. This one's just for fun. We took the SUV instead of the truck. No lesson. No route planned. Just 2 people driving with the windows down while the late summer air drifted through the cabin. It reminded me of those early evenings we'd spent on the country roads. Only now I wasn't nervous anymore. I drove naturally, confidently. You know, John said after a while, I barely say anything anymore. I noticed. You don't need me to. I guess that's the goal. It was. He looked out at the passing fields. It's satisfying watching someone become independent. I smiled. You sound like a proud teacher. I suppose I am. We stopped at the same overlook we'd visited weeks earlier. The view hadn't changed. The fields still stretched toward the horizon. The wind still moved through the tall grass. But somehow everything felt different. I've been thinking about this place, I admitted. So have I. We leaned against the fence again, almost exactly where we'd stood before. I think this became my favorite part of the summer, I said quietly. The driving. I shook my head. No. The conversations. John was silent for a long moment. Mine too. His answer came so naturally that it caught me off guard. I didn't expect that. I didn't either. He folded his arms on top of the fence. You know, when Sam first suggested I teach you, I thought I'd just be helping you get a license. And I ended up getting to know you as an adult. I looked down at the ground. I liked that. So did I. The honesty between us felt different now. Not uncomfortable, just deeper. There were no dramatic declarations. No impossible confessions. Just two people acknowledging that spending time together had come to matter more than either of them expected. As the sun began slipping lower, John finally broke the silence. You'll come by even after school starts? Of course. You don't have to disappear just because the lessons are over. I wasn't planning to. He smiled. Good. On the drive back, I realized something that had been slowly growing inside me for weeks. My admiration for John had become something more complicated. I respected him, trusted him, looked forward to every conversation. And that realization scared me a little. Not because he'd done anything inappropriate. He hadn't. Not once. If anything, he'd always treated me with quiet kindness and steady respect. The confusing part was entirely inside my own head. I wasn't sure what those feelings meant. I only knew they were becoming harder to ignore. And with college just around the corner, I wondered if a little distance might help me understand them better. College started with the usual chaos. New professors, group projects, too many deadlines. By the end of the first week, I was already wondering where my summer had gone. Felt strange not driving twice a week. Stranger still not seeing John. I hadn't realized how much those conversations had become part of my routine until they weren't. One Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was leaving class. John, how's school treating you? I smiled before I even opened the message. Me, already buried in assignments. A minute later, John, good. Means you're learning. I laughed. Me, you always have an answer, don't you? After a short pause, he replied. John, not always. Just enough to get by. Over the next month, we'd exchange the occasional message. Nothing constant, just checking in. Sometimes I'd send him a picture of a car I'd spotted that reminded me of one we talked about. Sometimes he'd ask how classes were going. Other times he'd simply write, drive safe. Those two words somehow meant more than they should have. October brought fall break. I drove home Friday afternoon. For the first time, I made the entire trip by myself. 3 hours. Highway traffic. Rain for part of the drive. A few months earlier, the thought would have terrified me. Now it just felt normal. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I instinctively grabbed my phone. Me made it home. A reply came almost immediately. John, I never doubted you would. I shook my head, smiling. Some things never changed. The next evening, my best friend invited me over for dinner. It'll just be family, he'd said. Come by around 6. Walking through their front door felt oddly familiar. John's wife hugged me the moment I stepped inside. It feels like we haven't seen you in forever. It's only been 6 weeks. Too long. From the kitchen, John looked up from chopping vegetables. Hey, Mike. Hey. He smiled the same quiet smile I'd seen dozens of times during the summer. But somehow it felt different now. Maybe because we hadn't seen each other in person for so long. Dinner was loud. Everyone talked over one another. My best friend told embarrassing stories from college. John mostly listened, laughing every now and then. Felt exactly like it always had. And I found that comforting. After we ate, my best friend disappeared upstairs to take a phone call. His mom started cleaning the kitchen. I automatically began helping. John handed me a towel. You still volunteer for cleanup. Old habit. It's appreciated. We worked side by side for several minutes. The rhythm felt familiar, comfortable. You've changed, John said quietly. I looked over. Good change or bad? Good. You seem more confident. I shrugged. I think getting my license helped. I don't think it was just that. What then? He dried another plate before answering. I think you finally started believing you were capable. The words landed harder than I expected. I've been thinking about what you said. About confidence. He smiled. Evidence. Yeah. I actually wrote that down. You did. It made sense. John laughed softly. I don't usually get quoted. You should. Later that evening, I was getting ready to leave when John stepped outside with me. The air was crisp, the first real hint of autumn. You driving back tonight? Yeah. Weather says fog later. I'll be careful. I know you will. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached into the garage and handed me a small flashlight. You should keep this in your glove compartment. I looked at it. I already have one. You have two now. I laughed. You really think of everything. I try. I slipped the flashlight into my backpack. You know, I said, I don't think I ever properly thanked you. You've thanked me plenty. No, I mean, for believing in me before I believed in myself. John looked genuinely surprised. I just gave you driving lessons. It was more than that. He was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. I'm glad you see it that way. As I opened my car door, he called my name. Mike. I turned. I'm proud of the man you're becoming. The words caught me completely off guard. For a second, I couldn't think of anything to say. Finally, I managed. That means a lot. I know. He smiled. Drive safe. I will. The drive back to campus was quiet. Not because of the road, because my mind kept replaying that sentence. I'm proud of the man you're becoming. There wasn't anything romantic about it. It sounded exactly like something a caring mentor or a father figure would say. And maybe that was why it stayed with me. John had spent the summer teaching me far more than how to operate a car. He'd shown me patience, confidence, the value of listening before speaking, the importance of believing in yourself through steady effort instead of instant certainty. As the campus lights appeared in the distance, I realized something. Whatever confusing feelings I'd wrestled with during the summer had settled into something much clearer. What mattered most wasn't trying to define them. It was recognizing how profoundly one person's kindness and guidance had shaped my life. Winter break arrived before I knew it. Final exams were over. Projects had been submitted. For the first time in months, I had room to breathe. The drive home felt different from every trip before it. Not because the roads had changed, because I had. 3 months earlier, I would have been anxious the entire way. Now I turned on some music, settled into the driver's seat, and simply enjoyed the drive. Somewhere outside town, I caught myself smiling. John would have been happy to see that. A couple of days after Christmas, my best friend invited me over again. We're putting together the new shelves Dad bought, he texted. You in? I answered without thinking. Of course. When I arrived, the garage looked like a hardware store had exploded. Boxes, boards, instructions spread across the workbench. My best friend groaned dramatically. Who writes these manuals? John glanced over. People who expect you to read them. I was hoping to skip that part. I know. I laughed. Some conversations never changed. The three of us spent most of the afternoon assembling cabinets for the garage. Eventually, my friend disappeared inside to answer another phone call, leaving John and me tightening the last few bolts. You've gotten pretty handy, he said. I had a good teacher. I only showed you where the wrench was. You also showed me not to force things. He looked at me with an amused expression. I've said that before. More than once. He laughed. I should be careful what advice I repeat. When we finished, we stepped outside with mugs of hot chocolate. Snow flurries drifted lazily through the air. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. I've been thinking about next year, I said. Oh, I accepted an internship. John's face brightened immediately. That's great. It's in the city. I'll have to move for the summer. He nodded. Congratulations. I was nervous about taking it. I almost stayed close to home. What changed your mind? I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. You. He raised an eyebrow. Me? You kept saying I didn't need certainty. Just direction. A slow smile spread across his face. So I did. I finally understood what you meant. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The snow continued falling around us. Quiet, unhurried. Finally, John said, You know, every parent hopes they leave their kids a little more confident than they found them. I glanced over. I'm not your kid. No. He smiled warmly. But I care about you. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I care about you too. There wasn't anything complicated about saying it anymore. It simply felt true. A few minutes later, my best friend burst through the back door. There you guys are. We've been looking for you. John laughed. We've been standing in the same place. Mom says dessert. That's a much better reason to interrupt us. We all headed inside together. Watching them joke with one another, I realized how lucky I'd been. Not everyone found another family that welcomed them so completely. The night was winding down when I grabbed my keys. John walked me to my car, just as he always seemed to. You heading back tomorrow? Early. Roads might be icy. I'll take it slow. I know. He hesitated before speaking again. One last thing. What? He reached into the passenger side of his truck and pulled out something long and flat. It was framed. What is it? Open it when you get home. You like surprises too much. I've learned they're memorable. I laughed and placed it carefully on the back seat. When I got home, I carried the frame inside. Under the wrapping paper was a photograph. It had been taken during one of our drives at the overlook. I was standing beside the SUV, laughing at something John had apparently just said. I'd never even noticed someone taking the picture. Along the bottom of the frame was a small engraved plate. Every good journey begins with the courage to start. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Then I noticed a folded note tucked behind the frame. Mike, teaching you to drive was never the important part. Watching you grow into someone who trusts himself, that was. Keep asking questions. Keep showing up for people. And wherever life takes you, remember that you'll always have friends waiting for you back home. John. I folded the note carefully and slid it back into the frame. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply, John, thoughtful, steady. The same person who had handed me a set of car keys months earlier and quietly believed I could do something I wasn't sure I could do myself. As I hung the frame on my apartment wall after returning to school, I realized it had become about much more than driving. It reminded me that sometimes the people who change your life don't do it with huge speeches or extraordinary moments. Sometimes they do it one patient conversation, one lesson, and one act of kindness at a time. Spring arrived before I realized how much had changed. My internship had started. I had my own apartment for the summer. Every morning, I drove through downtown traffic without thinking twice. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at something small, checking my mirrors before changing lanes, leaving extra space in the rain, taking a deep breath instead of rushing. Little habits that had become automatic. Every one of them traced back to John. Near the end of June, I drove home for a long weekend. As I pulled into my parents' driveway, my phone buzzed. My best friend, barbecue tomorrow. Dad says you don't have an excuse this time. I laughed. Tell him I'll be there. The next afternoon felt familiar in the best possible way. The grill was going. Music drifted through the backyard. Neighbors wandered in and out of the gate. John stood by the barbecue wearing the same faded baseball cap he'd worn all summer the year before. When he spotted me, he smiled. Look who finally remembered where we live. I've been a little busy. So I've heard. He gave me a quick hug before stepping back. How's the internship? I love it. You look happier. I am. Later that afternoon, my best friend disappeared with a group of neighbors to toss a football around. John and I ended up sitting on the deck with iced tea, watching everyone else laugh across the yard. So, he asked, still enjoying driving? I actually do. I never would have guessed that after lesson 1. I almost quit after lesson 1. I know. I still remember. We both laughed. You know, I said after a moment, I kept something from that summer. Oh, the little flashlight. John smiled immediately. You still have it? It's in my glove compartment. Used it twice. I figured you would. I also still have the travel mug. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. I didn't think you'd keep that. It reminds me where my confidence started. He looked at me for a long moment. I don't think it started with the mug. No. It started with someone believing I could do something before I believed it myself. The words hung between us. John looked out toward the backyard before answering. I've been thinking about something too. What? Remember when you thanked me after your driving test? Yeah. You gave me more credit than I deserved. I don't think I did. He shook his head. I opened the passenger door. You were the one who learned to drive. I smiled. Maybe. But I don't think I'd be the same person without those conversations. John leaned back in his chair. You know what makes a good mentor? What? They eventually become unnecessary. I frowned. I don't like that answer. He laughed. I know. But it's true. The goal was never for you to need me. It was for you to trust yourself. As the evening wound down, everyone began saying their goodbyes. I grabbed my keys and headed toward my car. Just like he always had, John walked with me to the driveway. Some habits never disappeared. You heading back tonight? Yeah. It's about a 3-hour drive. I'll stop if I get tired. Good. He nodded once, then added with a smile. I don't have to remind you anymore. No, you really don't. For a second, we simply stood there. Then I held out my hand. Instead of shaking it, John pulled me into another brief hug. I'm proud of you, Mike. I know. And I smiled. Thank you. For everything. He stepped back. You don't owe me thanks. I know. But I wanted you to hear it anyway. The drive back to the city was peaceful. As the miles passed beneath my tires, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. I'd started the summer afraid to drive, afraid to make mistakes, afraid to trust myself. I ended it with a license, a career I loved, and a quiet confidence I'd never had before. People often talk about the moments that change your life as if they're dramatic. Mine wasn't. It was a patient man sitting in the passenger seat, reminding me to slow down, to look farther ahead, to trust myself. Those lessons had never really been about driving. They had been about growing up. When I finally reached my apartment, I carried my overnight bag inside and glanced at the framed photo hanging on the wall. Below the picture, the engraved words still read, "Every good journey begins with the courage to start." I smiled. John had been right all along. Confidence wasn't something you woke up with. It was something you built 1 mile, 1 lesson, and 1 small act of courage at a time. And every time I turned the key in my car, I carried those lessons with me.